Welcome everybody to Digital SAT from the Bluebook Test 2, Reading and Writing Section 1. My name is Vince. Let's get straight into this thing. All right, number 1, we have to complete this with the most logical phrase or word. Word in context is a good idea to predict the answer before you look at the choices. Don't look until you've at least tried to predict. If you really get stuck with the prediction, then give up and look, but try. So if I read this thing, in the 1800s, the scholar made this first script or writing system for an indigenous language because it represented the sounds so accurately. It was easy to learn and thus quickly achieved blank use. Then we have a colon, which means we're about to explain what we just said. By 1830, over 90% of the Cherokee people could read and write it. So this is probably a good time to predict. I think I know exactly what's coming here because we know like everybody's using it and widespread. Oh, wow, that's super small. Let's try that again. I'm going to predict widespread. And I swear to God, I didn't look at the choices before I predicted that. I know that's one of the answers. And of course, the right answer is A because we just described how it's widespread. So just a reminder when you're predicting, you can even predict a phrase, you can predict, a word that comes to your mind. As long as it's justified by something in the text, then we're going to be happy. So try to predict, guys, at least try. All right, let's do this again. Same thing. Like the 45 plate imagines, blah, 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 prominently features women. In both plays, the all-female cast blank an array of female characters, including a strong mother and several daughters dealing with individual struggles. All right, let's predict again. I'm going to predict the cast shows an array of female characters, right? And if I look at the choices here, the only thing that makes sense to me is comprises. That means kind of like is made up of. So kind of the same thing as not exactly what I predicted, right? Like you don't want to like get married to your prediction. but it's useful because it can prevent you from getting sidetracked. But here we kind of had to adapt. We didn't really have a choice that meant shows. But instead, comprises just kind of means made up of. And that makes sense here because it's like, telling us what it's made up of, a mother and daughters. Awesome. Awesome. Let's congratulate ourselves at every opportunity as we do this. All right. During the dig, they uncovered a skeleton of a woman buried with valuable objects. This finding may persuade researchers who have argued that Bronze Age societies were ruled by men to blank that women may also have. And I can kind of predict here that they're going to make a concede. And again, I'm predicting that I'm not like, I did do the question before. I couldn't kind of help but pick concede though, because it's literally the only word that kind of makes sense here. Actually, I shouldn't say that. We could have also predicted a word like admit. Concede means like admit, sort of. So, right, because they're conceding it might have been women as well in leadership because they've got this evidence of this woman with a high degree of power. So there we go. Let's move on. Concede is right. So now we're getting into a bunch of like dramatic stuff in poetry in this test. Have we got to part? And I always like to look ahead and see what the choices or what the question's going to ask me to do, because I don't want to just read this with nothing in mind. I guess it's underlined for me here. So have we got to part? I'm afraid so. It's painful to part from people whom one has known for a very brief space of time. The absence of old friends one can endure with equanimity. And I'm going to predict something like deal with here, because, endure kind of means deal with. And it's almost like just a vocab question. We need something that means endure or deal with, tolerate, right? Because there's the contrast between people who you've only known briefly, who it's somehow hard to part with, and then versus an old friend so opposite, it's hard to tolerate the brief person. Whereas the old friend, you can tolerate. That's my point. All right, let's move on. We've got this poem from a person from a tribe. And we got to read this thing, right? Because now we need the main purpose. The main purpose. Again, we're going to try to predict before we look at the choices. And we kind of have to get into this thing. I'm looking at the title as well, because that could be a clue. New roads winding, beating of the drum. A new beating of the drum. Men's eyes shall have fresh seeing. Gray lives reprise their span. But under the new sun's being, completing what night began, there'll be the same backspending. The same sad feet shall drum when night finds its ending. It's kind of just seems like I'm predicting the main purpose is to kind of say how repetitive life is. It kind of I'm using the title to kind of help me with that. It's like a cycle. The sun rises, we're still doing the same thing, the same. We have a lot of like repetition here. Even though there's new things, there's these same things. That's kind of what I'm getting. A lot of times important things have to happen after a shifting word like but, that creates a contrast. It's like this new stuff is happening up here, but then there's the same old down here. So things are new, but the same at the same time. That's kind of my prediction. And I guess the only thing that I see here that makes sense to me is A, because that's the only thing that's talking about like the sameness, the repetitiveness. None of the other choices mention that repetitiveness. And that's what I was looking for, so I pick A. All right, here's a poem at Newport. And now we need the function of the underline portion. Usually what we have to do is kind of consider how it fits into everything else. What is its job? What is it? Why did the author put it there? And I'm going to predict again here. Let's read it first, though. Oh, deep delight to watch the gladsome waves exultant leap upon the rugged rocks, ever repulsed yet ever rushing on. So I think we're still talking about the waves here, filled with a life that will not know defeat. And I think I can, because she kind of goes into another topic, or she's talking about the sky and the sea. I want to just stop and predict if I feel like I can, and I'll think about it after I read the rest of the poem. But I'm going to predict, like that the waves are persistent, or they're persevering. In other words, they're, as you can see, I can't spell that word, but persevering. It's basically saying that they're overcoming, the struggle, and they're still going. That's what it means when it says ever repulsed yet ever rushing on. So they're getting repulsed or pushed away, but they keep coming, and they will not know defeat. Okay, that's persistence and persevering. And if I look at the rest of the poem, we see the sky, the snowy sails, unknown world, sweet enchantment, clearing the brain, making the heart leap joyous as it own bright singing waves. So I guess that sort of helps me get that the waves are like a good thing. And I'm just kind of like collecting my thoughts here. I want to pick something that goes with that. The waves are like positive, they're persistent, and if I look at B, that's exactly it, right? Relentless and enduring. So that's kind of what we predicted here with the persistent and persevering. So we didn't really need the rest of the poem here. One thing we kind of could do is to kind of recognize, like, what are we talking about in lines 3 and 4? What are we talking about in those lines? Well, logically, we're still talking about the thing we just finished talking about before. That's what we do. We keep talking about stuff. And if you look back, we're talking about the waves. So logically, we still are, unless the topic changes. So kind of makes sense to pick a choice about the waves. That's really the only choice that has waves in it other than D. And then we're not really getting the speaker's thoughts here. And that we're not creating a contrast between anything. We don't know the speaker's thoughts. Actually, we do. We know that there's deep delight. So you might think, okay, we're talking about the speaker's thoughts. But guess what? Lines 3 and 4 aren't. You know, they're just talking about how the waves are like good, you know? Okay, cool. So it's B. All right. We have overall structure of the text. This is kind of like purpose. We want to say like what happens, then what happens, then what happens. And it's kind of similar to what the text is going to say, but you can also just think about like, you know, like if this was a structure, you know, first, what do we do? Then what do we do? Then finally, what do we do? And if we see, this is the lucky mistake. Alante and Ronaldo are neighbors who have secretly been exchanging letters. And this time I'm just going to read the whole thing. Alante gave the letter to Charlotte, who immediately ran to the balcony with it, where she found Ronaldo in a melancholy posture, leaning his head on his hand. She showed him the letter, but was afraid to toss it to him for fear it might fall to the ground. So he ran and fetched a long cane, which he cleft at one end and held it while she put the letter into the cleft and stayed not to hear what he said to it. But never was man so transported with joy as he was at the reading of this letter. It gives him new wounds for the generous. Nothing obliges love so much as love. So it seems if I was to give like a play-by-play recap here, I would say, okay, they figured out a way to get the letter to the guy, finally got it, and he was transported with joy, which means he was really, really happy. Okay, so we're looking for something like that. And pretty simple, A is right? Delivery of a letter, that's what we said, and then happiness at the letter. Boom, easy. Okay, main idea. What are we doing here? This is from The Secret Garden. Marry a young girl recently found an overgrown hidden garden. Now, we always want to read this blurb. This is the SAT trying to help us understand the passage, pretty much. Okay, what did Mary do? She was an odd, determined little person. Now she had something interesting to be determined about. She was very much absorbed indeed. She worked and dug up and pulled up weeds steadily, only becoming more pleased with her work every hour instead of tiring of it. It seemed to her like a fascinating sort of play. So she likes gardening. Isn't that our main idea here? Like she's really into gardening. And yeah, that's D, right? She's really into gardening. Pretty much. Very satisfied, right? She likes it. I think we knew that. Okay, another one. Main idea. What's the main idea here? I don't know. Let's read it. Believing that living in an impractical space can heighten awareness and even improve health, these artists designed an apartment building in Japan to be more fanciful than functional. Okay, and I'm getting that the building is kind of fanciful. That kind of means like kind of whimsical as opposed to functional, which means useful. Okay, and remember at the beginning we had this impractical, so I'm thinking, okay, they made an impractical kind of fancy building. And then the next sentence kind of like goes into more detail. The kitchen counter is chest high on one side, knee high on the other. Ceiling has a door to nowhere. The effect is disorienting but invigorating. After 4 years there, they reported health benefits. Okay, must have been the house. I'm just laughing because like who knows why this guy or woman got healthier. But we know what we're looking for here, right? The apartment building is like it's good for you, even though it's kind of weird and impractical. And that's D, right? It's impractical, but it may improve the well-being. Pretty much what we said. Pretty straightforward. Okay, this question for some reason was in Blue Book Test 1. Don't know why it's here again, but let's do it again. Poet of our race, the speaker is addressing Paul, who is black. Thou, with stroke of mighty pen, has told of joy and mirth, and read the hearts and souls of men as cradled from their birth. Okay, what did we just say? The guys are writing about joy and reading like people in terms of what they're like. The language of the flowers, thou hast read them all. So he understands the flowers. And even the little brook responded to their call. So he can talk to the brook. Just translating this into normal English as opposed to poem English. So the guy I'm anticipating, we're talking about how good this guy is at kind of getting in tune with people and nature. And yeah, that's A. Praise a certain writer for being especially perceptive regarding people and nature. Okay, easy enough. To you is a poem by Walt Whitman. In the poem, Whitman suggests that he deeply understands the reader. So we need something that's going to say, that's going to illustrate that. He deeply understands the reader, whom he addresses directly. Okay, so direct address would be nice too. Your true body and soul appear before me. Okay, that's deep understanding, right? If somebody says that to you, you know, they're like your soulmate, right? They understand you deeply, or if, at least they're claiming to. So yeah, that's definitely deep understanding. And the address is directly your, okay, he's addressing you directly. All right. What I love to do with these is to kind of ignore everything unless I need it. And what I'm going to do here is cheat a little bit. And honestly, I'll give you two options. First, we're going to do the cheat way. Then we're going to do the way like a teacher would tell you to do it. But I'm not a teacher. I'm a tutor. I want to tell you the easy way. So we need to just find data from the table. That's why the table's there. We're going to have to look at it. And then we need to support the researcher's claim. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to even look at anything at all until I know what the claim is. And I mean, this is just me. You don't have to do this. But look at this at the end. A lot of times that's where the claim is. They claim the two languages with very different spoken rates, so different rates, can nonetheless convey the same amount of information in a given amount of time. And even before I look at the choices now, I can kind of glance at the table and I see it's pretty easy to read. Rate of speech. So we want different rates, but we want the same amount of information. So what I'm thinking to myself is I want to find two entries that the rate is very similar, but have different, or sorry, the rate of information is very similar. You know, this column on the right, but the column on the left, I want it to be different. And I can kind of see that if I look, the best example that comes to mind is look how similar Spanish and Vietnamese are with the rate of information, and look how different their rate of speech is. And if I look at B, once I do look at B, I can tell it's right because Vietnamese conveys information at the same rate as Spanish. That was our right column, you know, 42 versus 42.5 versus 42. But Vietnamese is spoken at a slower rate. Yeah, 5.3 rate versus 7.7. Now, you might not be able to be this person who does it like me, and that's okay. We can do it a slower way as well. But those of you who are sharp at this kind of stuff and good readers, you might be able to do something like I just did. We just have to make sure we know what the claim is. Now, for those of you who want a more methodical approach here, let's do it again, like a little bit more diligently. And I'm going to look at the title, rates of speech. Let's pretend I'm rewinding the question. Rates of speech and information conveyed for 5 languages. So I'm like, okay, I'm looking at rates for these 5 languages. Here I see the language, the title of each column. I see the rate of speech and the rate of information. And I see the numbers, but they're absolutely meaningless to me at that stage because I haven't read anything yet. And I'm not going to think about them for that reason. Now, when you're reading the passage, this is where I tend to be like, do I really want to read this? Even if I'm kind of like a more methodical, do it the right way, kind of follow the teacher's directions kind of person, I'm going to be a little hesitant to read all of this and think about it too hard because it's a lot of information. And I honestly want to skip ahead to the claim. And at that point, that's exactly what I would do. Even if you're that person, you know, I feel like this preamble almost is completely useless. Now, if we do read it, we kind of get a description typically of what the chart's showing. Hey, we did a study to determine the title of the chart. And then we're like, hey, I already knew the title of the chart, man. Okay, but whatever. And they're basically kind of telling us that it varies. So, or the amount of information it conveys doesn't vary as much. But to be honest, it didn't help me. You can tell my attitude about like all this text at this point, right? Like, I think it's kind of a waste of our time. However, if you find that you can't do it my way, go ahead and read the text. It's not going to hurt you. It's just going to take a little longer. But this will come to the same conclusion. We have the claim. We got to support the claim and, you know, pick something that's true about the chart. So there we go. it's still B. All right, moving on. Another chart. I think looking at this chart before, this is kind of interesting because we want to pick data this time that weakens the student's conclusion. Okay, so I'm going to do it the same way and see if I can get away with it. And just go straight to the student's conclusion. I see something about spider count, and I see something about with lizards and without lizards. If only every graph was this simple. We got spiders and lizards. How many of them are there in terms of the spiders? So what does the student think? The student concluded that the reduction in the spider population in the enclosure with lizards by day 30 was entirely attributable to the presence of lizards. And looking at the chart, now I have to think about what does it mean? Okay, the spiders with no lizards were the gray bar. The spiders with lizards were the black bar. We can see that the gray bar declined over time. The black bar declined over time faster, kind of implying that the lizards ate the spiders. So if I want to weaken the thing that this student said, it's already weakened. Like it's such a bad conclusion because the spiders or the spider count without lizards went down even if there weren't lizards there. So it's not just going to be lizards. Maybe they're dying for some other reason, or dying, maybe just escaping, escaping the enclosure. And that's what we see with B. The count just declined by day 30 in the enclosure. So we can kind of predict the answer here for this weaken type of question. At least we should try, because it's kind of like a glaring error from the student. And we can kind of be like, hey, like what actually did you miss here? Just because it went down from the lizards, guess what? It went down without them. So you can't tell me it was just the lizards. So, okay, let's rewind again. Imagine you didn't want to do that. And you're like, hey, let's get the lay of the land first. Let's look at the graph, spider population count. And that's just the title of the graph. Here we have spider count. And then the day of experiment is like the day 1, day 10, day 20, day 30. And then we already talked about the bars. And this tells us the methodology. And honestly, it's not as long and complicated. So it's not going to, be as annoying to read as that last one. It's 2 sentences. So much easier to just kind of read it in this case and just be like, yeah, whatever. It's just going to be slightly more helpful. So this one I would be like, I just talked a lot about like, hey, I don't need to read the text. In this case, it's probably like a little easier to read the text because it's so short and simple. And it's like, okay, I see what you're doing. You're putting spiders in these 2 enclosures. And it's, again, they both went down. And, that's definitely weakening the argument that this student made that it's just lizards. I don't know. It's kind of silly because no student would make that conclusion, I'm pretty sure. It's like, duh, what do you think happened to the one without lizards? They also died. So it's not just lizards. Okay, logically completes the text. We have to make something make sense here logically. And the good news is like the normal part of your brain that is normally logical will operate exact same way here. So let's read this. Although military veterans make up a small proportion of the total population of the United States, they occupy a significantly higher proportion of the jobs in government. Okay, good to know. One possible explanation for this disproportionate representation is that military service familiarizes people with certain organizational structures that are reflected in civilian government bureaucracy. And this familiarity, and let's predict here, right? This familiarity makes them better at those jobs, right? Because we have that fact here. They occupy more jobs in government, and then it kind of gives us a reason that they could do it. And it would make sense that logically the familiarity is what helps them. And that is makes civilian government jobs especially appealing to military veterans. Sure, that makes sense, right? And it's just kind of like logic. It's like there's more of them in the jobs. Here's a reason that they're just more familiar with that type of structure. And the familiarity makes them take those jobs. So just kind of basic logic there. All right. Now we're in grammar land. Pompeii, which is buried in ash, continues to be studied. Unfortunately, as blank attest, so researchers attest. And this is one of those times we want to just pick a choice without a comma. There's no good reason to use a comma here. Therefore, we don't use one. We need reasons to use commas. We don't want to just use them because we feel like it. This is one time where there's no rule about using a comma, and therefore we don't use one. So a lot of times with names, the SAT will try to do this to you. They'll kind of give you some options like with commas. But if you don't have names don't create like a rule to use a comma. So a lot of times those kinds of questions involve no comma as the answer. Okay. Let's do more punctuation. Seneca sculptor Marie's blanket art comes in a range of shapes and sizes. Watt sewed strips of blankets together to craft a 10 by 13 inch something in 2014. She did and cast them in bronze, creating. So this is a semicolon because we need to separate two complete sentences here. That is going to make us use either a semicolon, a period, comma, and a fanboy conjunction. But we don't have that option. We only have a semicolon. And the two sentences are like if you stop reading its sampler, that's a complete sentence. And if you start reading with the word in, you read the rest of that, that's a complete sentence too. So the very fact that we have two complete sentences there, we need to link them with something other than just a comma. That's not okay. We need a semicolon. Okay. Gathering accurate data on water flow in the US is challenging because of the country's millions of miles of blank and the volume and speed of water. So we have to kind of like do trial and error here because there's a bunch of text missing. And this is another time we don't need a comma. Now, and is a coordinating conjunction, but in this case, it's not operating as a kind of separator between two complete sentences. Because we can't start the sentence with the word and here. If we just say and the fact that the volume and speed of water at any given location can vary drastically over time, that's not a complete sentence. So we can't use a comma and here. So we use it without a comma. There's no good reason to put a comma here either. If you did have two complete sentences, then you could use comma and to join them, assuming and made sense in that context. Okay. In assessing the films of Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, blank have missed. We need the next noun to be many critics, or we need the next noun to be the people who are doing the thing. So this is what we call an introductory phrase. We don't have the subject in it yet, so we have to kind of produce that subject as the next noun in the sentence after the comma. And what I mean by that is if you read the first part of the sentence before the comma, in assessing the films of Kurosawa, comma, notice we don't know who's assessing them. So the next noun has to be the person who it makes sense to be assessing them. So in this case, the critics, many critics. And I think, let me just think about C for a second here. I might not be able to explain this grammatically, but let's see. Because you might say the next noun here is critics as well. But I think C is just wordy. You know, there's just a bunch of unnecessary words in it, and that's why it's wrong. So notice A is shorter. Yeah, they're testing wordiness as well here, I think. And so I don't think C is grammatically wrong, but I think it's too wordy compared to A. All right. Now this one bothered me when I did it the first time. But it's one of those times where a semicolon is separating items in a list. This is for some dumb reason the SAT tests this. In real life, trust me, as an adult in his 40s, this crap almost never happens. But whatever, we're going to have to deal with it. So let's read this carefully and just kind of talk about it a little bit. Joshua Hinson, director of this language revitalization program of the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma, helped produce the world's first indigenous language instructional app, Chickasaw something. And then we have this bunch of other things. But the thing that I notice is there's a semicolon, and it's not separating two complete clauses or sentences. It's separating items in a list. And I kind of know that because the word and the fact that everything from and to the end of the sentence isn't a complete clause. It's not an independent clause. So I'm like, you know what? Damn it, this is one of those times I'm going to have to think about semicolons in a list. And the way that works here is that items in a list are sometimes separated by semicolons if those items in the list have commas within them. So let's think about this. What did this guy do? He helped produce the first, and look at choice C with me as we kind of go through this. He helped produce the world's first app, Chickasaw Basic, comma, in 2009. That's the first thing he did. Everything, from 2009 backwards is the first thing he did. He helped produce the world's first app, Chickasaw Basic, in 2009. Now, let's continue reading. Here comes the next thing he did. An online television network, Chickasaw TV, in 2010. So that's the second thing he did, again with the semicolon. And then final semicolon and a Rosetta Stone language course in Chickasaw in 2015. So we're basically using it to separate the three things he did. Because if you look at like one of the things, for example, it has like a comma in it. So notice the comma after the word basic, the first, thing he did, making the app, there's a comma in that thing that he did. So instead of using commas to separate the items in a list, which would be kind of more confusing, we use semicolons to separate them. So this is one of those times we have to deal with that rule. All right. This one also kind of tricky if you missed it. So let's read this one. A group of ecologists in Germany examined the defensive responses of two varieties of the sweet potato. Sweet potato plant. And the right answer here turns out to be a colon, because now we're going to kind of describe what we just said by listing, the things it does. TN57, which is insect resistant, and TN66, which is much more susceptible. But the thing that I check, we want to make sure that everything before the colon, in other words, everything leading up from the beginning of the sentence to the colon, that has to stand alone as a complete sentence. And if we check it, it does. A group of ecologists examined the defensive responses of two varieties of the sweet potato plant, period. Notice that could be a period. Therefore, it can be a colon. And then after the colon can kind of be whatever, and in this case, it's just like listing two things, which is fine. So we're happy with the colon here. It would be inappropriate to have nothing here, and it would be inappropriate to have a semicolon. The semicolon would imply that everything after the colon was a complete sentence, and it's not. So with the period. You can kind of notice like the test will not make you choose between two things that do the same thing. Semicolon and period, they do the same thing. So they're both wrong, in other words. Okay, 21. Logical transition. We have to think about what the sentences mean. So, we realized much of Earth had been covered by some great sheets of ice. Some theorized that the phenomenon was cyclical, occurring at regular intervals. Okay. Each ice age is so destructive, though, that it largely erases the geological evidence of its predecessor. And it's kind of like a therefore. We can predict that therefore they were unable to confirm the theory, right? Because we're like, hey, we have this theory, but guess what? It like just erases the evidence. And then kind of logically speaking, therefore, we can't confirm anything. So hence means therefore. So that's correct. Now the note takers. So for those of you who are sharp readers or quick readers or strong readers out there, I'm going to give you the way that I do it, and you might appreciate this. For those of you who are like a little more cautious, you might just read the notes, but I don't want to read all the notes because inevitably like half of it doesn't matter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look straight at the question. We want to compare the lengths of the 2 rail tunnels. And honestly, there's probably only one choice that does this, even if I don't look at the notes. Does A compare the lengths of 2 rail tunnels? No, it's talking about some tunnels. Nope. Does B compare the lengths of 2 tunnels? Yep. And we're done. Why read those notes when you can just answer the question? There's only one choice that does the comparing of 2 lengths. Now you might say, what are we even talking about here? Okay, fine. We're talking about tunnels. If you look back at the notes, it talks about 2 different tunnels. One's in Japan, one is in Europe. Did you need to know that though to pick the only choice that compares 2 tunnels? Not really. C doesn't compare 2 tunnels. It doesn't compare the lengths of 2. D doesn't compare the lengths of 2 tunnels. They're just like, hey, these are both tunnels. Where's the length? Okay, only B does that. Just trying to save you guys some time. So let's look at the next one and try to do the same thing. I don't want to read all these notes. I mean, this is what we like to take shortcuts when we can do so safely on the test. And again, same thing you just heard me say. Now we need to specify the reason the Pleiades appearance changed. So I know from previous experience, Pleiades is a constellation. So maybe that's an advantage, but whatever. But I just need a reason it changed. Now A is just talking about the Pleiades having 7 stars. Okay. This B doesn't give me a specific reason that the appearance changed, so it's wrong. C does give me a reason that the appearance changed, because the stars move so close together that they appear as one. That's for a specific reason, and the appearance changed. It's now 1. And then D is just saying that, the appearance changed, but it doesn't give me a reason. So we needed a reason. So if you just read the question carefully, you can get these note-taking ones right sometimes without looking at the notes, which is kind of cool. Again, the notes will contain information like, hey, what are we talking about? And, the cluster has 6 stars now, and because they've moved close together. So you might say, hey, Vince, you could benefit from reading those because you could kind of predict the answer you're looking for. And I'd be like, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you could. Definitely another way to do it. Don't feel bad about doing it differently than me, because the advantage you have there is you will know what you're looking for better than I did. But again, just options. So let's actually try to do this with this one. And this time I'm going to just to mix things up here. I'm going to look at the notes, but I'm going to try to answer the question in my own words first. Never a bad idea. As long as I don't stress out about that. If it's hard, sometimes I can't. So we want to emphasize the fossil's significance. So I'm like, not about fossils, not about fossils. Okay, she found a fossil, but I don't hear anything about the significance. Okay, this 4th one, this seems to be a big deal. It's rare and it's transitional. And then the 5th bullet point explains what that means. It illustrates an early stage in evolution. So I know what I'm looking for now. I want to pick something that the fossil she found is interesting because it illustrates an evolutionary stage. And that's exactly what C does. So you might prefer that. Now, I'm kind of, one thing I'm doing here that you may not be able to do is I'm just very quickly reading the choices. And if you find that you're getting bogged down in that detail, it might be a vote to not just read them all mechanically and just look at, the answer choices like I did first. Or no, I didn't mean to say choices. Not reading all the bullet points mechanically if you're like a super slow reader. But as you can see, if you're a strong reader, you can, or probably an average reader, you can just kind of read these bullet points and be like, all right, I kind of know what I'm looking for now. That's comforting because when I see the right answer, it's easier to think about it. So just to give you 2 ways of doing things here. More notes. we want a difference between the two portraits. And this is a similarity. This is not talking about two portraits at all. This is a difference between two portraits. This is a unrelated thing about, it's not about portraits. Therefore it's C. Another one. All right. And this is kind of a complicated question. The role a misconception played, so something they didn't understand or got wrong, in the naming of a place. So this is not talking about a misconception. You might think B is about a misconception, but it's not. It's just saying California was called California after a fictional place. Just because I call something after a fictional place doesn't mean it's a misconception. It's just I'm calling it California after a fictional place. This is not a misconception either. Finally, with D, we have a misconception. Thinking was an island. Spanish explorers called a peninsula, which is not an island, California, after an island in a popular novel. Okay, that's a misconception. That's the only choice that gives us one. So again, don't want to read all these notes if I don't have to. Okay, and here we go, another very similar thing, similarity between the two paintings. And I bet you there's only one choice that does this. Similarity between the paintings. This is not talking about the paintings, it's talking about the year they were painted. This is talking about a difference between the paintings. This is a similarity between the two paintings. They're both big. And this is a difference. So as you can see, you know, easier for me to do just looking straight at the choices after reading the question. So hopefully this gave you some ideas about how to do things, maybe a little differently than you would have done them yourself. I'll see you guys in the next video when I'll do the average or the normal second section of this test, reading and writing.